I see that people are starting to trickle in. We're gonna give it a couple minutes for everyone to join. And Alex, I know you have a warm-up question.
Yeah, well, I was going to ask, what is the metaphor we're looking at here with this cliff when it comes to BEAD? Is that intentional?
Yeah, beyond
Sailing
BEAD.
it, or are we going left to right, or are we going right to left?
I don't think either of those are good, because if we go right to left, we smack into a cliff.
Well, you gotta put your on belay, right?
I didn't do that well in physical education in high school.
Yeah, PE is the class that suffered the most when we all had to learn online. That's for sure. Well, I think it's a metaphor for opportunity. So
Yeah, I like Kevin Tagling put in the chat that we're bridging the divide. So that's the divide that we're bridging. All right, well, it looks like we have a critical mass, so we're going to go ahead and get started. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining. We have a wonderful panel of experts today. We've got Jake Varn from Pew Charitable Trust, Alex Kelly from the Center on Rural Innovation, Ryan Johnston from Next Century Cities, and Peggy Schaefer, who is now with the American Association for Public Broadband, but you may have known her from her time with the Maine Connectivity Authority. So we are so excited to have all of you. And we are going to get through a lot of stuff today, but if anyone has any questions, feel free to drop them in the chat. We got a lot of really great questions from registration, so we'll make sure to include those in our remarks, but we want this to really be helpful for people who are here. So if you have questions as we're going along, there's no question that we're afraid to answer, so feel free to drop it in there. And if we could go to the next slide, we'll start with a little overview of the BEAD and NTIA programs. So just to kind of level set where we're at here, NTIA has 3 major funding programs that are going out right now. You've probably heard about BEAD, the Broadband Equity Access and Deployment Program, which is the biggest pool of funding. There's also the Digital Equity Program and the Middle Mile Program that are running on similar overlapping timelines. And Jake, did you want to give a little bit of an overview of what those programs are and what they mean for people?
Sure, I can touch especially on the first 2 and kind of where we're at in terms of NTIA's rollout of them. So as Corianne was mentioning, these are programs that were produced by the bipartisan infrastructure law that was passed. There is a deliberate planning phase for both of the broadband, the BEAD program and digital equity program. States are the primary conduits of these funds from NTIA, especially for, there's going to be a separate competitive digital equity program, but more details are still yet to come on that. But the bulk of the $65 billion that was for broadband from the bipartisan infrastructure law is going through states. And so states were tasked with coming up with a 5-year action plan, as well as a separate but integrated digital equity plan. So all states have received their awards or initial approval for awards, and they have a deadline of 270 days to submit a 5-year action plan, and I believe 365 days to submit a comprehensive digital equity plan, of which will be factored into the 5-year action plan that's due a little bit sooner. So every state has received at least an acknowledgement of some degree of the awards of planning funds that they have to do that work. Those started rolling out as early as September last year, and the bulk of them came out in December. So if you think ahead in your mental calendars, 270 days as to when those will be due, we're looking at late spring into the summer and early fall for the vast majority of states for the 5-year action plans. And we can talk a little bit more about the actual deployment of the funds, but that's kind of where we are at right now for states everyone is in really a dedicated planning position for figuring out how the current state of broadband access within their state and state of digital equity within their states and territories, and starting to plan out and engage with communities for the how they will be able to spend funds to provide affordable high-speed internet access for all.
Thanks, Jake. And I think the thing you said at the end is something that is on a lot of people's minds right now, because we know that with the BEAD program, there will be lots of locations that get funded that currently have broadband at the current minimum threshold, but don't have the high-speed, high-quality service that they need. So we got a really great question from registration about this that I'll turn to Ryan. Will the federal definition of unserved remain at 25.3? States that receive BEAD funding increase the minimum speed to something else?
Sure. So yeah, the 25.3 standard's been in service for, I think, since 2015 now. And earlier, I guess last year it would have been in, I believe, July, Chairwoman Rosenworcel put out a notice of inquiry at the FCC, asking people whether or not they thought that an increase to 100 megabits down and 20 megabits up would be something that the FCC should consider. I think the record showed that overwhelmingly there was a lot of support for that. Unfortunately, with the way that the commission is currently deadlocked, it's very difficult for the chairwoman to get something like that through. So we do have a very good record that shows that there is support for increasing that standard. We just need that fifth commissioner there to make sure that that actually gets voted on, so that the FCC can up that standard. I know that the chairwoman has also put out a more future-looking separate national goal of 1 gigabit down and 500 megabits up. So we have these two kind of next stepping stones that we're going for. One being one that we can might be able to get to here in the relatively short term, and then one that is a significant long-term goal.
However, for the BEAD money, the 25.3 is set in statute for that money.
Yes, for the underserved portion of that, or unserved.
I think that's a really important point too, that the programs being run by other federal agencies have these higher standards than what the FCC is using. And so the projects that are going to be awarded will be have higher speeds. The BEAD program in particular has a pretty clear preference for fiber projects, or 100 scalable, or 120 and scalable upwards. So it's kind of an interesting position that the federal government is in terms of having different definitions for things, but the big pots of money that are going out to build broadband projects have higher speed definitions.
We're getting a lot of good questions in the chat. If we can just stay on this point about service quality a little bit longer, I think it fits really well here. Will latency ever be considered as part of the definition of unserved, underserved, and served?
So there is a standard within, I'd have to pull up the exact language, but there's a standard within the BEAD definitions for latency, as well as terms around what qualifies as reliable service. And some of that will be determined at the individual state level in their initial proposals that they'll put forward to NTIA for how they will actually disperse these funds. But yeah, there's definitely some active conversations about latency.
The other thing the FCC money number 25.3 does not include is cost, right? So you can get, in Alaska, you can get 25.3, but it's $10,000 a month. And so therefore you're served even if you can't afford it. And that's an extreme example, but it is true across the country, where the only thing that the FCC considers served is actually that number. It's not the throughput, it's strictly throughput. It's not the affordability. It's not the latency. It's not any of those things. Again, none of that will change until we get a fifth commissioner.
Yeah, and Ryan, you might have more to say. I know that we have the broadband labels slated for later in the agenda, but maybe you could talk a little about that now, because I know you've been doing a lot of great work on this.
Sure. So right now we are kind of at the point where the commission has put out rules on the consumer broadband nutrition labels. And really what they're currently saying is that this label has to include kind of the unique designator for what the plan is that you are subscribing to, the typical speed that a consumer might be able to reasonably expect that they would receive, and then their prices being the rack rate or that monthly rate that you're going to pay. If there is a promotional rate, that does have to be disclosed. So really that's kind of the nitty gritty of what we, and then there's latency and some other network management statistics that are on there, but that's really kind of the broad strokes of what's on the label. There's currently a kind of further notice of proposed rulemaking out that is asking about whether or not the commission should be adding things like an average speed or state and local taxes, all applicable discounts that a consumer may be able to receive. So really trying to figure out what nuanced information the commission needs to add into that label to make it really robust in a way that will actually make it a very useful transparency tool. One of the things that isn't going to happen is, and hasn't come up in this current round of comments, is having that label on a monthly bill. So currently there's two places that you can see your monthly, or you can see this broadband label. One is next to the marketing material for a provider. So when you go to a provider's website and are looking at the plans that they offer, they have to have that label in full right next to the buy now button. So you have to be able to see everything, that every piece of that breakdown that would go into that label. And then once you've made a purchase, you have to be able to access the label for your specific plan on your provider's portal. So like if you would log into your internet service account, you have to be able to see that label. You don't get that on a bill, unfortunately, so it's maybe a little bit more difficult to kind of compare, get your bill across what you're supposed to be paying. And then the other thing is all of these things have to be kind of machine readable. Basically, assistive technologies, analytics tools that you would be able to use to scrape data have to be able to look at these bills, or have to be able to look at these labels and pull information in a way that wouldn't require some kind of human intervention. So it really will help aggregating some of that cost data, aggregating some of that service data. But right now, I think we have a good start to where the labels should be. Hopefully in the future, as we move through this current comment period, and hopefully kind of iterate the labels after they start to get out and we actually see how the providers are putting them together, we'll be able to see a little bit more of what consumers need and what they don't need from these.
And thanks for all your work on that. I know you're helping us all get better, more clear internet bills in the process. So our next question is for Alex. Alex, are you seeing any movement by cable providers to increase their base upload speed? And I think that this also ties into one of the other questions about if the definition of unserved gets changed, what does that do for the definition of underserved, especially if like the upload speed is changing when I know a lot of people are pushing for more symmetrical speeds. So if you could answer both of those, that would be awesome.
Sure, I'll try. So like many different telecom technologies, cable is how fast the speeds are you can get with cable depends on kind of how up to date your infrastructure is and how up to date the electronics and equipment in your infrastructure is. Now, cable is tricky because most of the systems are kind of patchworked around the country. They probably were, before they were Comcast systems, they were smaller independent operators that got built. So the variety of quality of infrastructure that cable can provide around the country is quite wide. Now, there are upgrade paths for older cable systems to become faster and faster. There are cable systems that can achieve 2 gigabit download and essentially gigabit upload in great conditions at this point in time. Where the investments are being prioritized are the major urban markets where fiber is competing strongly with cable. So you're not seeing those upgrades in a lot of the areas where cable has effectively a monopoly. You're not seeing a lot of the upgrades unless it is prompted by intense competition from other providers. So it is happening. It's not happening all at once. And it is a capital and labor intensive activity to make those upgrades, which is why it's not like flipping a switch, right? The cable providers have to spend a couple $1,000s per mile to switch out all the electronics, for example, to go from an older version of their technology to newer. So definitely seeing it happening. It's not uniform. And unless you have good fiber there as well, or you're about to get good fiber, it's probably not going to be worth those cable providers' effort to upgrade your cable speeds.
That's great. And then Peggy, if we could turn to you for a minute. I see there's a question about in the chat about promotional rates and applications, and I think this might tie in with some of the work you've done around mobilizing community stakeholders to impact fabric challenges and keep ISPs accountable. If you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think when the BEAD money and also the capital projects fund money look very strongly at an affordability rate and not just ACP, right? So it isn't just that somebody who's qualified for the ACP program, whose name I have now forgotten what that means, it can get an affordable rate. The idea is that there is an affordable rate for everybody, right? And that actually turns out to be a bit of a problem if you're talking about municipal networks, because they sometimes need a little higher than that to make the investment. But that is part of the look. When May looked at it, we always looked at, is there a rate in there that is affordable as part of their score package? Many companies do offer a promotional rate, but we used to ask for, and states should ask for, the promotional rate and the ongoing rate. So the first 6 months, first year, whatever is X. What is it after that? Because that really is the key to whether the service is going to be affordable long term. I mean, you see this a lot on promotional rates on for cable and whatnot, that it's $50 a month, and then in a year out you're now paying $80 a month. So that's a key issue. And one of the reasons that you do, there's a lot of reasons to do community organizing and community planning around this, but one of them is to better understand exactly in your community what your community looks like and what it really can afford. Right. And so a lot of times when the communities start this, they don't know, or they haven't really paid attention to the level of income to people in town. And it isn't always just poverty. There's also middle income people who really can't afford that kind of connection. And so that's one of the key pieces about community planning, not only identifying what it needs to be served or what the community would love to be served at in terms of speed, but also what people in the community can afford, and the whole piece around digital inclusion and digital equity. How do we make sure that when we build this network, the people in the community are going to be able to use it, have devices to use it, and know how to access it?
Yeah, that's really important. And I love that you hit on every single piece that we need to bring this all together, that it's not just about access, but also about having skills and devices and all of those other wonderful things. And Jake, next I'm going to turn it over to you. Could you talk a little bit about, we know that mapping is on everyone's mind right now. Could you talk about how we can help improve those maps and make sure that they're as accurate as possible for all the funding that's coming?
Yeah, for sure. I do just want to quickly pick up on Peggy's point there about community engagement. So like we said, right now, every state is in this planning process and meeting with local communities. They have to, they have to take in local voices as part of the requirements for putting these plans together. And then they also have to create an initial proposal, like we said. And so you can see on this slide, there's this marker in the end of June for when NTIA will announce how much money each state will be allocated, which is based on the map, tying in a few different questions here. That will open up the submission period for states to be able to submit their initial proposals. And like I said, that'll detail the exact, nuts and bolts of how their programs will work and how it will comply with the requirements of the BEAD program, one of which is how the program will ensure that awarded projects meet a yet to be defined level of middle income affordability, or middle class affordability. So as your state broadband office is meeting with your community, having an eye towards those requirements, and specifically how the program will reflect affordability measures, will be a really key part. So if anyone has not yet been in contact with their state broadband office or is not signed up for their cadence of community outreach events, I would definitely recommend doing so and putting that on your list of questions or your list of opportunities to provide input. Because once the initial proposal will also have to be published for community engagement or for local input as well. But the earlier you can get into those conversations and be talking about the needs of your community, the better. And that will need to be reflected and then eventually approved by NTIA before funds can be deployed. To get back to Corian's actual question, mapping. So the last time we actually, or several of us on this webinar got together was around the deadline in January around the FCC challenge process. And it's a deadline in kind of an interesting way in that it assumes the maximum amount of time that a provider and an individual challenger could go back and forth on a challenge before it is eventually resolved, ahead of working backwards from that June 30th date. Challenges are still being accepted and being resolved in the meantime. So if you do have a challenge or bulk challenges, you are definitely still encouraged to submit those. There's going to be an update to the FCC maps. Not to spend way too much time on this, but there's a kind of tiered process of the FCC updating the fabric of locations that creates what undergirds what the map is. They update that and then they send that out to providers to then report their internet availability on top of, and then that version of the map becomes public and that becomes available for challenges from an availability perspective. But to challenge the actual fabric, you have to go back to that initial version that the FCC creates. So we're going to get the version 2 of that sometime this spring, and then a version 3 again 6 months after that. So we'll continue to be updating throughout. So there's a few key periods for communities to be looking at in terms of trying to make sure that map is as accurate as possible. The fabric of version 2 will be important for informing the availability that's released on version 3, if you're following this kind of like stepped process for how the FCC does this. So if you look at probably the earliest possible version of what a state could be using, because they're required to at least start with the FCC's map, they can propose to the NTIA, and they will have to propose a challenge process that will apply their own data, as well as have another opportunity for providers and the public to challenge it. But if you're working back from the earliest possible version of the map that they may use, it'll be that version 3 likely. It'll likely be that version 3 that'll be coming out in the fall. So engaging on the fabric this spring, make sure those locations are right, and going forward will be really important. And then working on the availability that's reported both through what the state will release as their challenge process, as well as the fall version of the map. And yeah, we can talk more about like the methods of doing so, but that's kind of the timeline of things that are happening.
To me, the most important thing about this challenge thing, the having your community figure out what's out there and engaging in an active and aggressive speed testing strategy are really phenomenal organizing tools, right? So they have 2 purposes. One purpose is the result, right? You get a better idea of what's happening in your community, you have good speed tests, but the big piece of it is engaging people in your community in this conversation about what is it we have for broadband and how do we figure that out? And that is a central piece to begin this whole conversation about how we bring better broadband to our communities. So to me, the mapping piece is really important because it matters who gets served and who doesn't. But the real basic start of it is it's a phenomenal way to encourage people in your community to get engaged in this conversation. And I would also say, as the states go out and talk to communities about what they need, don't just talk about availability, and talk about how the grant is structured, right? So are they going to give bonus points if you are very rural, right? So the further apart your houses are your scores going to be weighted because it's more expensive to build out there? Are they going to think about regional projects? Are they going to incentivize community-owned or community-led infrastructure projects? All of those things have to be a part of the BEAD process. And I think a lot of times when communities get into this conversation, it's about affordability. It's about, we want this, we want that. But it really, think about how the grant program is structured and how you can give input in that to make sure that your community is on a level playing field with others.
Yeah, I think so. Corian, you're on mute.
Won't just be used for the BEAD program. They'll also be used for all of these other funding programs that are coming out. So getting them right now is just so important. And like Peggy said, engaging the community as much as you can to make sure that at least the data is representative of the people who are going to be impacted by it is really important. And Alex, I'll turn it over to you, and hopefully you can also take this question in the chat about what about communities who have spent years planning for fiber to every home and business to be denied funding because a small percentage of their community is in an RDOF area? And I know I'm sure you've seen that time and time again. So I'll turn it over to you to answer that one.
Sure, great. So there has always been many different programs to provide broadband funding from, I think, at least 5 different federal agencies. And even though the BEAD program is getting most of the attention, now is no different. So I wanted to touch on a few different programs and their timing, just so that everyone was aware of the full gamut of potential funding sources and how they're rolling out. So the ARPA funding, American Rescue Plan Act, was very flexible funding that was provided to almost all levels of government. Broadband is a perfectly acceptable use. It needs to be obligated by the end of 2024 and then spent by the end of 2026. So great program, very flexible, can be used as match against other grant programs in many cases. It can also be used in areas that have RDOF awards. So that's one, depending on whether that's been built or not, and things like that. It's often useful for that because it's so flexible. CPF, the next line, Capital Projects Fund. This is a pot of money that is flowing through the states. So all states are on different timelines. Not all states are using it for broadband, although many are. And some states have already established these funds and disperse them. States like New Hampshire and I believe West Virginia. Natalie Roper can correct me if I'm wrong, but some states are yet to do that. So we expect that to be those grant programs, capital project funds, to be run through the end of this year for the states that haven't finished them so far. I wanted to put the Economic Adjustment Assistance Program on here, which is line number 3, because it's so flexible, and it also, when you're talking about areas that have, that may look served on a map or may have an obligation like RDOF that's technically serving those areas. The EAA program is another one that can be flexibly used in those situations. So this is a program through the EDA. It's distributed on a rolling basis, so it's open now. You have to be a higher poverty or higher unemployment location to score well on this, but you don't have to use traditional broadband served or unserved or underserved markers to be eligible. This program cares about whether you're going to be able to create jobs. And so if you can prove that you'll be able to create jobs with this type of investment, that's what they're looking for. And it's been used for broadband in the past. Reconnect round 5 is going to happen this year. The timing of it isn't exactly published yet, but it's a great program. The USDA runs wonderful broadband programs. A few things to note about this is there's a pot of money set aside for areas that are 80 or 90% unserved and underserved, which is great, but there's also a pot of money set aside for areas that are only 50% un and underserved. So they use the 100 over 20 as a threshold, and especially for that pot of money that is allocated for the 50% served, 50% unserved areas, that could be another option if you have like a Swiss cheese of RDOF awards that are in your community that may or may not be built and served. And then speaking of RDOF, that program is a two-part program. The first part, which happened a couple years ago, is currently being deployed. It awarded money all over the country to hundreds of providers to build. They have quite a long timeline to finish their builds, and supposedly there's going to be a phase 2 of this program to clean up some of the areas that weren't obligated in the first round. That is supposedly happening this year, although I think there's some debate we can have about whether that's likely or not. And this is not a comprehensive list either. Does any of the other panelists have anything to add? There's a lot out there.
I would just throw back to the top 2 of the state and local fiscal recovery funds and the capital projects funds. Like, these are huge programs that are currently being deployed right now. So there's the data for state and local fiscal recovery isn't perfect that I've seen on broadband, but by some estimates, it's over 35 states have used it for broadband and allocated nearly $12 billion for it. There's another $10 billion in capital projects fund. I think we're about at half of the states and maybe around a third, I think, of the full allocation for that that have received their awards. And that's being updated by the Department of Treasury seemingly every month. There are new awards coming out for more states. And so, yeah, we're just starting to see the capital projects funds kind of hit the streets from state broadband offices. So if you're looking if you're seeing the longer horizon for BEAD and you have an immediate need, the capital projects funds is definitely should be an option for your community. And it's also the most, like Alex said, it's one of the most flexible. These are passed in response to the public health pandemic and acknowledgement of how important broadband is for these communities. And so the idea is that they will be able to move quickly and identify needs that the pandemic exposed.
Also, a lot of the state and fiscal recovery money is actually done, is actually locally distributed. So towns and counties. So it's a little closer to you than to communities than the state can be. And it can be used as match. So it may not meet all of your needs, but it is a source for match, and it's a much closer source to your community than the state might be.
There's another great question in the chat about what communities can do to prevent ISPs from cherry picking the most desirable un- and underserved areas. And I think that's the question of the day so far, because it's such an important thing to talk about. I know Peggy will have some good thoughts on this from her perspective at the state of Maine, but I would say from two quick things, and then I'll turn it over. One, if you are a grant maker setting up a grant program at the state level or something like that, make sure you have some mechanism for assessing the efficiency of a grant request that is not purely a per passing cost. So this is one thing that one repercussion of judging a grant application's efficiency by what amount of money are you asking for per premise that you're going to pass, right? Well, that incentivizes you to pick out or gerrymander or cherry pick the densest of the un- and underserved areas, and that can lead to perpetuating this phenomenon of kicking the can down the road for the hardest to serve areas. If you are a community and you have some of those areas, oftentimes you will be asked to form some type of partnership or even just endorse a grant application from an ISP in your area that wants to serve certain census blocks or neighborhoods. And you may be asked to contribute ARPA funding as match. You may simply be asked to sign a letter of support to attach to their grant application. And I would say that is your opportunity to be really informed and advocate for and use whatever leverage you can, whether it's funding match or just holding off on signing the letter, to advocate for the ISP to include every single premise in your jurisdiction, or push for as much as you can, right? That is your point of leverage and moment where you can exert your leverage to try to make sure that this pattern doesn't perpetuate. But I know those aren't the only two things that can be done. Does anyone have any other things to add?
Well, at a state grant level, the state should get a good map from the provider, right? So whoever's coming in for the grant should provide a live map so you can look at it. And this is the one advantage of one of many advantages of the broadband location data or E911 data, is you can look when they send you a map, you can look and make sure that every location is covered, right? And that includes looking at roads that don't connect anywhere else, right? So if you're looking at a map and it looks like it covers everybody, but you look just outside of their coverage area and there's a road there that doesn't connect anywhere else, you got to make sure that that road is part of this build, or you're going to get a donut, you're going to get a hole there that it's going to be very expensive to fill around. So just make sure this, when the state program comes in, make sure that they are looking at the holistically map, right? Not just what the people gave them, but what are the roads around it? What are the locations on those roads? And are there any other ways that those houses that are not part of that grant are going to be covered? And if they're not, then those locations should be included in that grant coverage. You don't create any more donut holes. We got a lot of them.
There's also, just wanted to elevate the work that Ryan's doing at the federal level to combat digital discrimination through FCC policies. So Ryan, if you want to talk a little bit about that process and how that's been.
Sure. So with as most of the things here, with the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, under, I believe it's section 60,506, the commission is required to make rules that are intended to eliminate what they call digital discrimination. So really it is the equal opportunity to subscribe for anyone based on things like race, income level, national origin, generally the protected classes plus income level. And this is, I think, a really good opportunity for community members, individuals, states, really anyone to kind of make their voices heard in a way that says, this is what we're seeing in our community, this is what we're seeing in the state, this is what providers are doing. These are the things that we need to be able to help kind of close these really hard to, fill in donut holes in a way that, because these are going to be the rules that govern how we kind of effectuate change for these little pockets of very difficult to serve areas for the next decade, if not longer. So as we're looking at are we going to be putting out a good definition of what digital discrimination is? Are we ensuring that the tools that the FCC has in their tool bag to make sure that they're enforcing these rules are good? Are we making sure that the complaint process is easy to use for people, not just at a individual level, but for a state and local governments? Do they have a way to interact directly with the FCC to say, hey, this is what we're seeing, and here's the data that we have to support it, in a way that might be a little bit more official than just filling out a simple complaint online and having that potentially lost to the ether. And then really at the end of the day, looking at, what is, excuse me, but like, what is the, what are the ways that we can kind of build in some of these policies to the BEAD application grants that we're looking at? So trying to tie all of these things into not just BEAD. BEAD has a little bit of the digital equity side to it, but the digital equity grants that are also going to be going out, making sure that we are, if there are holes that the FCC hasn't closed, how are we building in those measures into state digital equity grant plans? So I think we have a really good start with what the FCC is doing, but they specifically note in their notice of proposed rulemaking that they are not intending to limit what the states do. So if states don't like how the FCC is handling this, the FCC's policies only constitute a floor. They do not constitute a ceiling. So states are more than welcome, if not encouraged, to go further to make sure that if there's any vulnerable populations in their community that aren't being served, that they can get served, with, and if not, there should be repercussions for that.
Yeah, and Ryan, since you brought up states, I am going to turn it back to Peggy to talk about. I know that we also had a question in the RSVP form where someone asked about overlapping funds. Like, we have all of these funding programs. How do we make sure that every area is getting covered, and what state's role in making sure that it makes it as far as possible without duplicating more than needed?
This is a question I hear all the time, and I'm never quite sure where it comes from, because having been a state broadband person, I knew where every single grant was, right? I knew where all our RDOF money was. I knew where all our Reconnect money was. I knew where our state grant money was. And so, I think people are there's an assumption that this stuff is all going to go on willy-nilly all over the place and nobody's going to know what's happening. And that's not actually going to happen, right? It's really not. It's not how this stuff works. The RDOF money and the Reconnect money and the RUS money are all mapped. They're all federally available on a map. You can look up and see where they are. The state grants, when they go out, they all should be mapped in terms of where it covered and where it didn't. State broadband authorities do know where they give grants out to. And so I don't think there's going to be a huge overlap of overbuilding a pre-federal grant, right? Unless it's allowed, right? So one of the problems with RDOF is that it's a 6-year build. And for many of these communities, 6 years is a significant wait. And so the ability to think about how you could build out over an RDOF area that's not going to be built for 6 years, I think is something that both the capital funds and the state and local funds allow you to contemplate that. In terms of reaching all the areas, I think that's going to be difficult, right? Because one of the criteria in BEAD is that you essentially have to serve all the 25-3 before you go to the underserved. Now, they did make exceptions for that, right? So the exception is a project can be 80% unserved and 20% underserved. And, when you build a network, you don't start at the end. You start at your CO and you build out. And what the restrictions on only building unserved happens is that everybody going to that unserved doesn't get served, right? And so they're all at 100 over 20 or 50 over 10 or whatever it is, or 26 over 4, and they don't get served, but they're going to need to be served before this federal money runs out, right? It's important that we get to everybody. So being really thoughtful about how you combine projects, so that you can use the federal money for the unserved and maybe your money or investment money for the underserved. But it's really important to think about not just getting to the end of the road, but how you connect everybody along that path. And that's going to be a huge challenge for states, given some of the restrictions of this federal money. But it is absolutely one of the pieces that communities should insist on, and that states should significantly think about how they're going to do that as they build out to these networks. Whether this money is going to get to everybody who's under 25-3, there's a whole lot of discussion about yes, no, some states probably, some states maybe not. A lot of that depends on, how much RDOF money got in your state and all that kind of stuff. Maine, I know we had about $34 million of RDOF money that was going to Starlink, and that's been turned down. So now we have all those areas without that money to serve. And so there's areas like that all across the country. It is definitely a challenge, but it is definitely why communities need to be really aggressive and active in helping shape these conversations at the state level, to help shape the state plan, to make sure that the grants do reach as many people as they can, and really think about how to use different money, right? So it isn't this, think about how, if your project can pencil out at a 50% match don't come in for a 75% match, right? Come in for a 50% match because somebody else is going to need that extra 25%. So really do your spreadsheet work, pencil this out, figure out where, if there's enough revenue stream to pay for part of this part of your project, and it doesn't all need to be federal or state funds.
I would just add, that's a real point of emphasis from NTIA to the states right now, is to be thinking about the level of match you're requiring to try to make sure that your funds can go as far as possible. Because yes, you do have to, your plan has to account for serving all of the unserved in your state before the underserved. For some states, you'll be able to do that simultaneously because they'll be able to reach their unserved. But yeah, the level of cost match. And then there's also this kind of still yet to be determined category of high cost areas that NTIA is working on, which will have a different level of requirement potentially for the cost match that's required. So there's a lot of like behind the scene calculus that states will have to be doing in terms of how much they can be awarding to different areas to make sure that the dollars go as far as possible.
Could you just give like a quick overview of like what is matching and why is it important for each of these funding programs?
Sorry, Corianne, I missed the first half of what you were saying there.
Oh, sorry, just like a one sentence summary of what is matching and why is it relevant for this conversation?
Oh, yeah, and others feel free to jump in here, but these different programs have different percentages that the grant applicant has to put forth. So if they're asking for 10 million, they're proposing a $10 million project under BEAD, they may be required to put forward $2 million either in their own funding or through another mechanism. So that's the cost match that they're providing in order to receive the public subsidy for the remaining 80% or 50% or 20%. And some programs, previous state programs, have had a sliding scale that they will award more points to projects that come forward with a higher match of the amount of money that they're bringing to the table as an internet service provider.
Again, a reason for communities to be engaged in these conversations, right? That make sure that the match isn't just the more money you can put in, the higher your grant is going to score, because for some communities, that's not possible. You can create a sliding scale based on the community's wealth and income. You can do a whole variety of things that make that match more level.
Mm-hmm. One thing that's interesting that I was actually just thinking about, Peggy, as you're talking about communities being, active in these conversations and making sure that they're able to ensure that their priority areas are covered. I just saw that Iowa came out with a new system for broadband. They're calling them broadband intervention zones. So the communities will be able to circle areas on the state's map and submit that with a justification along a set of criteria as a broadband intervention zone that the state would then include as a priority within their CPF program, I believe is the planned mechanism. But I'm curious if you have any thoughts on, and if we're running out of time, Corianne, just tell me to stop. Curious if you have any thoughts on how like those different mechanisms states have at their disposal could come into play.
Yeah, I mean, I think the whole, the one thing I would caution about community planning is that there are a lot of communities out there who have a great need, but not a great capacity to do community planning. And so when you, even though I'm a big fan of it, when you emphasize it heavily, unless you are supporting community planning with grants, right? So unless you are actively going out and providing funding for that community to do that planning, establishing priority areas for communities who have their stuff together can be it can ignore communities that really need it but don't have quite the capacity to get their stuff together. And so it's really important as states are putting together these plans to remember that community planning this is a tough job, right? And you're asking community volunteers to do it. And a lot of times they need some technical support. So part of your BEAD planning process, and certainly part of your BEAD planning money, as well as your capital projects fund money, can support those kinds of partnerships and making sure there is capacity in that region and that area to support that kind of effort. You know, community planning is great, but if you don't have the capacity to do it, it doesn't really get you very far. You know, so that's a key piece is as states think about community planning, that they include the support for it. You know, somebody said to me once that, you know, we pay engineers to do this work. We should pay volunteers to do it too. And I think that that's really important. This is a big lift, and supporting those volunteers with technical assistance, with financing, with a whole variety of things is really has to be the underpinning of why of what the state is going to put into that community planning process for it to really work. Otherwise, you're just getting ideas from people who are already organized, and that isn't necessarily everybody in the state. So, I mean, one of the strong things about BEAD, you know, I remember, I think it was Andy Burke said to us, like it was last March, that every single town in the state is going to have a chance to review your BEAD plan and reject it if they don't want it. And I was like a little panic stricken, right? But in order for the plan to really represent the state, it has to represent the state. It can't be a collection of ideas of people who are engaged. It has to be a collection of ideas of people who are not as engaged, right? And so that is a really important piece about how we make sure these community work gets done, is that we support it. It gets supported with some of this federal money, and we make sure there's a capacity out there to do this work.
And I do have one final question just to wrap us up. Just 1 minute for each person. We'll go Alex, Jake, Peggy, and Ryan. What are the key policies that states can implement to ensure that everyone has competitive access and high-speed internet?
Well, going first is the easiest. I get to cherry pick like we want to avoid the easiest answer. I would say make sure that you are allowing every tool in the possible tool belt of fixing broadband to be used on the problem. And by that, I mean, make sure that you are not making it harder for different flavors of partnership, different entities, public, private, non-profit, cooperative, to be a part of the solution, because clearly we need all hands on deck, and every community's needs and solution is going to be different. So broaden the field and broaden the aperture of the entities that can be applied to this challenge.
I guess that forces me to go next. I think I'll re-emphasize what kind of has become a theme of what I've been talking about this last hour, which is the planning process right now. Every state is engaging in it, but making sure it's as comprehensive and reaching as many areas, corners of your state as possible, that the actual meetings that you're having are reflective of the communities themselves, ensuring that local voices are actually able to be heard and participate in the process, and so that the plans that you're, as a state office, putting together are reflective of the actual needs. And so it's very hard work, and there's very few people in these broadband offices to do it. So I appreciate the ask that I'm making of them to have multiple meetings at different times and of different formats and different accessibility options. But it's really important. This is it was a very deliberate piece of the BEAD program to have this comprehensive planning process. And so being able to use it to its fullest to ensure that the programs that you're actually putting forward are reflective of the community input that you're able to gather right now.
And putting on my American Association of Public Broadband hat, publicly owned infrastructure that's open access. Make sure that your state plan includes that, not just as an option, but potentially as an incentive, because, you know, competition does work in terms of keeping down prices. Now, I know in a lot of rural areas, it's hard to have more than one provider. There's no question about that. But an open access, publicly owned infrastructure where more than one provider can run across that network is a solution for some of this work, right? It really is. That is a huge lift for communities. It's a huge lift to make that decision. There are lots of private companies who are interested in that kind of partnership out there, But it needs to be part of your plan, the state plan, and communities need to make sure it's part of the state plan, that their ownership of this infrastructure and their ability to provide open access if it's feasible is, you know, really looked at as a good solution for this federal money.
Yeah, and I guess to wrap things up, it's really hard to go last because y'all took everything. But this is, I think, less a policy and more of, I don't know, maybe some homework. And it's a piece that Peggy touched on. It's make sure that you as a community member, a state officer, or whomever you are, be involved with every aspect of this process, whether it is ensuring that if you're at a community level, making sure that something's in your state plan. If your state's not being receptive, make sure that you're talking to your state's FPO. If that FPO isn't being responsive, go bug the people at NTIA and DC. And make sure that you're also making sure that the FCC knows that you're having issues, that there are things that you need from the FCC to make all of these things happen, whether it be on something like the broadband nutrition labels or digital discrimination or any of the thousands of things that they work on per month. One of the biggest reasons the FCC often overlooks what communities are saying is because they say, well, nobody showed up in the record. And while that's a huge mistake, it is one of the easiest ways for a community to get involved, to make sure that the things that they have to say are on paper or in the record, and that the agency then has to turn around and say, we disagree with this. That makes it really hard to say, well why? It forces them to explain themselves. So if there are things that as a community or state, any of the people that we've talked about today have to do, just make sure that you are making your voice heard as loudly as you can.
Thank you so much to Alex, Jake, Peggy, Ryan, and to everyone who's in the audience who stuck around this whole time to listen to us talk about broadband and ask some awesome questions. We hope you can join us on the Broadband Resource Hub, because we're always excited to see questions over there too. And we're just so grateful to have spent this time with you today. Hope you all have a great day.
Thank you for
Thank you,
having us.
Corinne. Thank you all.
Thanks.
Take care, everybody.